Welcome to Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt. You're going to get a number of podcasts this week. I hope you appreciate it. I hope you appreciate all the flow that comes out of this. You know what I'm going to say. If you do, head over to the Patreon site. Kick in $1 or $10 a month. Would love to have your help. DougPagitt.com for that. Our conversation today is with Stephen Mansfield. He has written a book called Choosing Donald Trump. He wrote two other books about the faith of presidents. He wrote about the faith of Barack Obama, wrote about the faith of George W. Bush. This is not a book about the faith of Donald Trump as much as it is about the faith of those conservative Christians who support Donald Trump. So it's interesting. One of the learnings here, I'm just going to do a little spoiler for you. One of the learnings that I had in this conversation was Stephen's suggestion that to understand why conservatives would support Donald Trump, you need to see it from their vantage point, that they often felt traumatized by the Obama years. It was a real threat, an existential threat, and that Hillary Clinton would have been so much more, and that trauma would have been made complete and forever. So seeing the response of people to wrap themselves around Donald Trump as a response to trauma and not just fear, not only that they were fearful that their world was being taken from them, but they had felt very traumatized, is a powerful phrase that we get to in the book. Stephen is a bit of a historian. He also is an opinion about all this, and he expresses that he thinks there's been some real damage to the church about this. And so I hope you enjoy the conversation. It's called Choosing Donald Trump. The book is newly out from Baker Books, and hope you enjoy. And if you do, DougPagitt.com for the Patreon site. Thanks, friends. All right. Well, hello, everyone on live stream and those who are choosing to listen to the Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt podcast. Super excited about the conversation today with Stephen Mansfield. Stephen's the author of this very fine book that has come out just in the last few weeks on choosing Donald Trump. The God, anger, hope, and why Christian conservatives support him. And I got to tell you, Stephen, I am personally very excited about your feedback and answers to that question of how Christian conservatives and why they support Donald Trump. So congratulations on the book. And,
thank you.
It's you have written books about the faith of leaders, presidents. In fact, how did you get into that work in and of itself, and how is it that you're deciding to write about the choosing of Donald Trump like you did?
Well, you know, I'm quite interested in history, and I'm quite interested in how faith influences history. And so being also interested in leadership, I just began to study the American presidency from the standpoint of the faith of presidents, what they believed, how it affected them in the Oval Office. And so I wrote The Faith of George W. Bush, and that was at a time that he was running for his second race. And as we all recall, he wasn't real articulate about faith and real articulate about, his personal life. So the book answered a lot of questions Americans had. It did quite well. And then I also wrote The Faith of Barack Obama. I've written a book on the faith of Abraham Lincoln. So I'm just intrigued by strong leadership, presidential leadership in particular, and how religious faith has shaped our presidency and thus our American history. And so this book on Donald Trump is a continuation of that. I didn't want to call it The Faith of Donald Trump because I think that sort of assumes there's a faith that has defined him very consistently in his life, and that's not true. But still, I'm fascinated by faith biographies of our presidents.
Well, Stephen, I have two questions for you about that process. One is, how did you go about learning what you came to learn about Donald Trump? And more importantly, how in the world did you get this book out so fast and in such great shape so quickly? That's amazing. I can't unless you were working on the book during the election, assuming that he might win the presidency. How did you do it so fast, and how did you get the information that you have in the book?
Yeah, I have a bit of an advantage because I'm always studying faith and culture. I do faith and culture commentary for Fox and CNN. I'm always writing on those themes. I'm always studying those things. And so, in a sense, even though, of course, I couldn't have known who the president was going to be until November 8th last year, I had been studying those themes, the biographies of both candidates, et cetera, for quite some time. So then once we knew who was president, I could jump right to it. And that gives me a bit of an advantage. But I also, am fortunate in that having been writing for a while and it being the main thing that I do, I can clear my schedule and just focus on doing nothing but writing a book for the majority of 3-4 months. And that's about what it took to write the book.
Yeah. How did you find all the information that you know, we'll talk about the specifics of what you know about what the religious influences were on Donald Trump and then his influence on religious leaders. How did you come to that information and to learn all that you learned about him?
Well, I do a lot of interviews. I read a lot. I read everything that's available. So, once Donald Trump began to become prominent in the 2016 presidential race, I read every article I could get my hands on. I interviewed people around him. I'd never met him personally at that point. But I knew a lot of the people who were influences in his life. And you have to realize, too, that for most people, the thing that's influencing them, the factors that are influencing them are decades old. So there are books about them you have to digest. And in Donald Trump's case, for example, Norman Vincent Peale is the primary spiritual influence in his life. And so I read voraciously everything I could get my hands on about Norman Vincent Peale. So it's a kind of a combination process of watching the contemporary scene, but also keeping an eye on the trenchant articles, of course, but then a lot of historical research and a lot of interviews. It takes time, but fortunately, my firm and I are doing this kind of thing all the time. So, like I say, we have a bit of an advantage.
Yeah, well done. It's a great book. I think it answers some of the questions that I've had over the last number of months and better part of a year as to how religious leaders, especially, could support Donald Trump. Now, my bias is I wish he had not been elected the president. I'm a progressive evangelical. I'm torn on two sides. I don't think he should be president for my political aspirations for the world. But also I am so bewildered as to why and how Christian leaders could be so committed to supporting him. And I don't know if you felt this as much as I do, but this wasn't the case where leaders had to say to themselves, look, I just got to plug my nose on this one. I don't want Hillary. I vote conservative. I vote Republican. That's just it. He's my guy. Good enough. I feel like they were faced with another kind of a question about their own faith and about matching all the rhetoric that has been so important in the Christian conservative circles for so long and the evangelical conservative circles for so long, that it feels like they really abandoned something that had been meaningful for 3 or 4 decades by selecting Donald Trump. Did you have that sense as you were doing interviews and talking with people that there was a true struggle and that people of Christian leadership buckled under the chance to vote for Donald Trump?
Yeah, there's definitely a major shift that happened in 2016 in the very area that you're talking about. Earlier on in the history of what we call the religious right, Jerry Falwell, for example, decades ago, would have said, we want our presidents to be men of God, women of God. We want them to know the faith history of the country. We want them to be moral and ethical people. And that's what really inflamed the religious right to a large extent. Yeah. By the time we come down to 2016, it's really important for us to understand that the average voter and these religious leaders we're talking about really were traumatized by the Obama years. Oh. From their perspective, I would use the word traumatized. They felt like there'd been a strident progressive agenda. I'm aware that you just described yourself as a progressive, but if you're a conservative, evangelical type, the word progressive is not necessarly positive. You know that. You deal with that all the time.
Sure do. That's partly why
even with your own partners.
Yeah, all the time.
And so they stories, for example, of the Green family owners of Hobby Lobby being sued by the government for not providing abortifacients as part of their employee insurance packages, a strident LGBT agenda, all the things we can talk. Even small orders of nuns being sued. And so by the time you come down to the 2016 election, a majority of evangelicals. And we need to consider for a moment that Donald Trump won 81% of white evangelicals, half of all church attenders, and half of all Roman Catholics. Yeah. So at least that crowd felt traumatized by the Obama years and felt like the Hillary Clinton years, should they occur, would be worse or as bad. So they were willing to give up certain things they'd been looking for in previous decades. And this goes to your question. They weren't necessarily looking for a righteous person. They weren't even looking for a moral leader. In my opinion, and I shared this view with you, in my opinion, they gave up far too much. They didn't mind that he made, at least leaned towards racist statements. They didn't mind that he encouraged violence. They didn't mind that he, talked about hand sign as a metaphor for penis size. They didn't mind that he was crass. They didn't mind all of those things. They didn't mind the video kit that came out. In fact, some of the religious leaders we're talking about, though they would have preached a strict sexual morality throughout most of their ministries, made excuses for Donald Trump when the famous video came out. Said boys will be boys, literally said those words.
Yes.
So there's absolutely no question that religious leaders who on the right, conservative religious leaders in this country, definitely abandoned some things I don't think they should have to support Donald Trump. At the end of my book, I talk about maintaining prophetic distance, which is that you can encourage a person in office to be moral, to be righteous. You can pastor them personally. You can help them apply a moral grid to what they do in policy. You don't have to, quote unquote, get in bed with them. You don't have to join their PR team. You don't have to try to rebrand them for the populace. And so I think that balance, that caution, that nuanced approach was abandoned during the recent election, and I think there's going to be blowback in the evangelical world because of it. We're already seeing it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it could be in the list of the things that will make such a dramatic shift in evangelicalism that there will be a before and after somewhere in this period of the last 15 years. It's very helpful for me to hear you describe, and you do it well in the book, the trauma level that people were experiencing. Because my pitch has been, and maybe you've heard this from the other 19% of white evangelicals, that what was being represented in that 81% were people who it finally became clear they are first Republicans, then conservatives, then their Christian faith. Even though they've been saying for decades that it works in the other order, that first they're faithful and then their conservative beliefs kick in, and then their party affiliation. And this just felt like, I mean, these are the same people that voted for George Bush, then they voted for another set of excuses for voting for John McCain, and then they voted for a faithful Mormon, which was shocking to a lot of us, and then Donald Trump. It just doesn't matter. They're going to vote for the Republican, and that's that. And there's really, all this showed was there's no there to the other claims. And I've had conservative friends of mine who voted for him who've made the other argument, but no one's made it quite as clearly as you have there, that these were people who really felt there was an existential, their fear was at a deep level, not because they were hateful, but because they were traumatized.
Yeah, I think that's really, really true. I hate to speak in those terms, because I think as Christians, we should cling to a sovereign God, trust in him, and not be moved by the mores of the moment as much as people were during this election. But the fact is that they've moved to a very transactional state. There have been recent wonderful articles that have asked some of these religious leaders, why do you stick with Trump no matter what he does, no matter what he says, no matter what he, how offensive he is? And basically they have come back and said, because he gives us access we've not had with any recent president. And that means it's very transactional. That means I get something for what I give. So I give my endorsement to him, and then he lets me in the Oval Office. Well, that, in my opinion, is not what a Christian ought to be doing. That's not what a religious leader ought to be doing. And some of the great statesmen, some of the great voices of faith in our history, called presidents and senators and congressmen and people in elected office to their best. But we're also clear with them where they fell short, and maintained what I call in the book, and another guy, of course, acquired this from other people, the idea of prophetic distance, which is that we don't have to join their PR teams. We speak prophetically to them, small people. We speak the word of God to them. We call them to be better people. I think we've descended. I think we've stepped off the high ground in some cases to become transactional. And I think, again, it's causing great damage and great loss. Will ultimately cause some great loss to the evangelical community.
So this is Stephen Mansfield. For those who are listening, his book is Choosing Donald Trump, God, Anger, Hope, and Why Christians Conservatives Support Him. Stephen, you have there's an interesting page right at the beginning of the book. It's the dedication, which is a dedication to millennials. And then the next page is a quote from Martin Luther King from A Knock at Midnight, that famous piece where he says, the church must be reminded to not be the masters or the slaves of the state or the servants of the state, but to be the conscience of the state. That seems like a deliberate choice on your part to dedicate it to millennials, and also to frame this book, the table of before the table of contents, in that quote from King. Can you say a few things about why you dedicated it to millennials and what you were thinking about with the King quote?
Well, I actually like millennials very much, and I work with them a lot. I'm on college campuses a lot. I really admire the millennials. They're being much maligned. They're being much criticized. There's a lot of concern and fear about their influence in corporate settings and sometimes on our university campuses. But I like their social justice orientation. I like the fact that they are passionate about the things that they are. I mean, they're raw, they're crass, they're crude. They're just like me when I was that age.
That's right. They're like the Gen Xers.
But I think they've got a lot of potential. Yeah. And exactly. Yeah. And I think that they needed. I wanted to say to them, I think they're the ones perhaps most disaffected by the church voting for Trump. I've heard from a lot of millennials who just don't feel like they can go to their churches anymore and just mystified, that their church has become basically an outpost of the GOP. And by the way, I speak as a guy who's right of center here, so I'm not hammering conservatives. Yeah. But a lot of my millennial friends are deeply offended by that. So that's why I dedicated the book to them. I think they're on a journey, they're on a search. I think it's a noble search, and I wanted to encourage them. The quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, I think is very, very powerful from one of his great sermons. And I think, whenever you're going to make a controversial case, call in reinforcements. And there's nobody better to call in on this point than Martin Luther King Jr. So I knew I was going to make a case. I knew I was going to say, gosh, the religious conservatives went way too far in trying to rebrand Trump, and there's going to be blowback. So obviously, Martin Luther King said it decades before I did. He said the church should not be either the master of the state. We don't want a theocracy, nor should it be the servant of the state. We don't want a weak, servile, dominated church. It should speak prophetically. Again, I use that word small p. It should speak powerfully to the state, call it to its best, remind it of a moral grid, remind them of the poor, remind them of social justice issues, and speak, quite frankly, the will of God. And I think if we were that kind of church, I think the millennials will admire us, not that we want to do it for that reason, and many in society will admire us and listen, even if they don't agree. But this transactional thing that's going on right now will endorse you in exchange for access. I think that's a stepping down off of the high plane of what we're called to.
Your way that you were able to in the book to describe the circumstances around Donald Trump's pathway into the evangelical consciousness, first of all, outside of them, maybe a lot of them watching him on television, but him as a possible leader in the world is interesting. And it strikes me that utilizing a quote from Martin Luther King at the beginning, which I'm a big fan of, so I think it's great. There was a time 30 years ago when evangelicals didn't think very highly of Martin Luther King Jr., right? There was a lot of pushback in the world. And so I can see this kind of trajectory where now you having that quote there, it feels to people across the religious spectrum that that's a reinforcement you would want to call in, where a number of evangelicals 30 years ago really thought about Martin Luther King in a way that, they didn't think very highly of him. So I bring that up to say you can really see this kind of sea shift, that this shifting opinion about our leaders and about the role that religion should play in the world.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like, did that cross your mind as you were thinking about your audience for this book and the people that would care about Martin Luther King or not?
Well, I quote Martin Luther King quite a bit in my speaking, and I often see conservative evangelicals roll their eyes or go stony-faced. Some of them are still not adjusted to who he is.
Right? Okay.
But I'm on the Hill all the time in D.C., and right there in the Hall of Statues in the U.S. Capitol is a great big old statue of Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah. So I think the ship has sailed as to whether he's an influence on our society. Let's remember, by the way, that one of the things he was doing in his life was getting a rather weak and vacillating JFK, and I'll leave that on the issue of race, to come to the party and to engage in social justice and to fulfill the Constitution and to keep his word. So when he was talking about the church speaking, quote unquote, prophetically to the state, in his day, his issue was primarily race in the Vietnam War, and he was speaking to officials who were as vacillating and in some cases as immoral as Donald Trump is. Right, and I don't mean immoral now; I just mean in his total life. Yeah. So I think Martin Luther King Jr. is a good guy to study from the standpoint of him having to confront these leaders and call them to a moral perspective and a constitutional and call them to the best that America is. And I think that's what we have to do today.
So there's two other characters that show up quite a bit in your analysis here, and that's Norman Vincent Peale and Paula White, who for a lot of people listening or watching this, those names might be strangely familiar from somewhere. They're not totally sure. But for your mind, those two really played an outsized role in making Donald Trump acceptable to white evangelicals and therefore to get the support he needed to become the president, that Norman Vincent Peale and Paula White sort of collaborated together over time to make Donald Trump the president of the United States.
Well, it might be a slight overstatement, yeah. but I think that the bottom line, and you're absolutely right, you can't understand Donald Trump if you don't understand those two people. Norman Vincent Peale, people may not know the name, but they will know the title of his main book, right. Which is The Power of Positive Thinking. People have actually read it, I've discovered, who can't remember his name, but they do remember the title.
Absolutely.
And Norman Vincent Peale is important. He was the pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan, which is where the Trump family went to church. He was the main religious influence on Donald Trump. And Norman Vincent Peale is very, very interesting because on the one hand, he believed what he called, this is a quote, the born-again version of Christianity. And he preached that in his church from time to time. But publicly and internationally, he was mainly known as what we would now call a motivational speaker. Yeah. He talked about the power of positive thinking. He talked about attitudes being more important than facts. He talked about, your words can shape your reality, things like that, things we hear on Oprah now, things we hear from some of the more famous, motivational speakers. Yeah. And I believe that Donald Trump drank more from that second stream in Norman Vincent Peale's life than he did the whole born-again transformation in Jesus approach to Christianity. I'm not saying it's an approach, but it's a theme, obviously, main theme of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so Donald Trump tells us that Norman Vincent Peale told him that he was his main disciple, that Donald Trump was Norman Vincent Peale's main disciple. Yeah. But I think the part of Norman Vincent Peale that Donald Trump drank from was that motivational speak. And having read a lot of Norman Vincent Peale for this book, I got to tell you, I hear it coming out of Donald Trump's mouth every single day.
Is that right? Like for you, having refreshed your memory of Norman Vincent Peale and having to take it from the 60s and 70s into today, that's what you're hearing in Donald Trump. Do you mean the way that he overstates or the way that he creates a mental picture that might not match the lived experience, but is more preferable and desirable than the lived experience? That kind of thing that President Trump does?
Yeah. I mean, how many times have we seen Donald Trump lay aside statistics or facts and lean instead to attitudes?
Every single day, all the time.
We might call it posturing if we want to be negative. Yeah. Well, that's straight out of the book of Norman Vincent Peale. He might not, if he was standing here today, be happy about the way Donald Trump is doing it. But Donald Trump first learned that you don't have to be bound by facts, that your attitudes and your positioning, your posturing is more important. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm not saying that Norman Vincent Peale would have sanctioned everything that Donald Trump is doing today, sure, yeah. But there's no question the fundamental motivational win, you can be a winner, be victorious, change your circumstances, shape your reality kind of Donald Trump comes right off the pages of Norman Vincent Peale.
Make America great again. That kind of notion right there. That's a classic Norman Vincent Peale notion. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the issue, I'm not jousting about words. I think everybody would like America to be great again. The question is how.
Yeah, right.
And so some of the Donald Trump's approach, like for example, to start his presidency with a petty argument about the size of his crowd, at the inauguration, for example, or to constantly be, I wrote a book, as I've already said, The Faith of George W. Bush, and paid a great deal of attention to George W. Bush's visits to Walter Reed Hospital, visits to wounded soldiers, prayers with families, and so on. So when Donald Trump gets up and says, no other president has, made these calls and things like that, I mean, he's trying to shape reality through his words and attitudes. I don't even think he really believes it's real. Wow. It's the way that you shape your reality. It's the secret. It's basically the theology of the secret transported into politics.
And then Paula White comes in the scene. So more people would know of Norman Vincent Peale if they're our age or a little older, but maybe younger people would know Paula White, a pastor in Florida, a strong voice in certain streams of Christianity. And she really became the modern day force supporting Donald Trump and helping him to envision and giving him access to a whole lot of other people who would have liked to found access to that he would have wanted access to a potential presidential candidate.
No, there's no question about it. Paula White, for those who don't know who she is, she's a very prominent television preacher, female, pretty, shapely, and so very influential, especially in the Black community. And Donald Trump heard her one night years ago, saw her on TV talking about vision. And it was the kind of thing that Norman Vincent Peale used to teach. It was all about vision and how you can accomplish a vision for your life. He called her, became friends with her. She became sort of chaplain to his family and his business. When he decided to run for president, he asked her to begin to hold listening sessions for him with prominent clergy around the country. So in these listening sessions that Paula beautifully scripted and did so across denominational lines, that's when he learned about the Johnson Amendment. That's where he learned about religious liberty issues. That's where he learned about the crises in the inner city. That's where he learned about the struggles, to the extent that he knows, about the struggles of African-American pastors or Hispanic pastors in America. And these are things he began to talk about in his campaigns. It's what convinced religious people, religious conservatives anyway, that he had their best interests at heart. And it came straight from those listening sessions. Now, the cynical can say, well, he learned the language but didn't really gain the heart.
I was about to say that. Yeah, that's good.
Sure. And religious conservatives can say he got a real education and learned who we are and he really joined us. Yeah. But either way, when he got up and talked about religious liberty, when he even sounds sometimes a little bit silly talking about the war on Christmas, or people are going to say Merry Christmas again, you and I would look at each other and go, I'm not really living in a dearth of Christmas greetings.
No.
But if the president wants to address it, fine. At least what he was doing was sounding a tone that won a lot of religious conservatives. And all of that came from the very hard work of Paula White. There's just no question that even to this day, as we all know, she actually prayed at the inauguration.
Right.
She very much shapes the theological tone of this presidency. It's a very unusual matching, but it's very decisive.
That's incredible. And I've known a bit of that. Your work here has been very helpful to see the depth of it. I had no idea about the depth of it. And the group of people that Donald Trump has brought around him, it struck me that there's something similar about those people's lives, how they live, how they present themselves in the world, and Donald Trump. Paula White's got a big presence. She had a bankruptcy. She's kind of caught up in some scandal. Like there's some similarity. Big money in some of those religious traditions in that religious world, right? And I'm wondering if you sense that part of what was happening here was a similarity of person. Like Trump saw in them, oh yeah, these are my kind of people, and they saw in Donald Trump actually, yeah, he's sort of our kind of person on all those other kind of levels, right? That look and feel, and he looks a little like a televangelist, if you know what I'm saying, right? There's kind of a cultural norming. You see what I mean? Like, is that part of it? Do you think there was a clique there that wasn't theological only and wasn't even about politics? Because who knows where Donald Trump was on that? But there was a sense of, hey, these are my people, and frankly, Obama and Clinton and those other progressives, they just don't feel like my people, but these feel like my people. And that the religious leaders said, oh my gosh, he's more like us than Jeb Bush or Rand Paul or something. He's our kind of guy. Like he goes through the struggles we go through. And Paula White's had a difficult life and divorced, and that's very public. And same with Donald Trump. And she was abused, and there's narratives of abuse. So it just feels like there's some things in there that they've both been public about that makes a match. Now, I'm sort of being a psychologist here, but do you have a sense of that?
I do. I think you're right. I think there is a commonality of culture. I think the idea that they're wealthy, that they're flawed, that they've had failures in their background, that they've dealt a lot with public criticism. They've got opponents. I think the fact that if I say to you, hey, I'm going to send my jet for you, that's completely foreign to your culture. Maybe you've never been on a private jet in your whole life,
that's right.
but or maybe you've been on 100 of them. I don't know. But my point is that you step more readily in my world if I'm sending jets for you.
That's right.
If you've got a jet of your own, or you've been on jets before, or if I'm staying, at a $10,000 a night suite, and you are, and I say, hey, come up and stay with across the hall, and you don't have a problem spending $10,000 a night on a hotel suite. Well, then all of that becomes common. So I definitely think there's a philosophical and theological agreement, so to speak. I think that Donald Trump is drawn to prosperity preachers, as they call them. I think that's a pejorative term. He does feel more comfortable with them. He's drawn to them. He likes themes of success and accomplishment and winning and all of that. He picks up a book somebody, some preacher's written that says you can win. I mean, that's virtually Donald Trump's, life motto.
Right.
So yeah, I think there is a commonality of culture. I think it does make a difference. I think they speak the same language, live on the same grand scale, although of course he's wealthier than any of them.
Sure.
And I think that there's sort of the God layer underneath all of it that that both of them genuinely respect. And now I'm saying something positive about Donald Trump. I think he does have a genuine, broad respect for God, and he likes people who are, and I'm being a little humorous here, Goddish. So if you're Goddish, then he's drawn to you, and I think that's at a personal as well as a public level. So, but I think you're absolutely right. They're both, the commonality of those cultures was something I think that was a great draw to him.
Yeah, and I could imagine that pastors or other church leaders or people in religious streams who look up to those Christian leaders then felt like, I kind of want to be a pastor like that. Like I've got a little, but I would like it to grow, and I'd like for my territory to expand. And you start to see that narrative feeling like you have, and sometimes Christian people, as one, I've been around this culture a lot, can feel very beleaguered. So when someone from outside of your world starts to talk about you and your things in positive ways, it makes you feel like even from the mouth of that one, there's some support coming, right? It can be a very intoxicating kind of notion for people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be pejorative, but the reality is that a great many Christians and a great many Christian leaders are like abused children. Mm-hmm. They will take affirmation from wherever it might come from. They will take acceptance from wherever it might come from. I know that sounds terrible and critical, and I'm sure some people will not be comfortable with that. But I think the bottom line is that evangelicals, particularly who are trying to be at all of influence in politics, will basically gravitate to those who share their values and will pat them on the head. I mean, that's being pejorative, and I'm doing that intentionally. And Donald Trump gives a big welcome to those folks. And again, I say openly, I'm right of center. I'm not sorry for some of the things that he's championing. I wish we had a better champion. But for example, I'm pro-life, so I can't be sad that Donald Trump talks pro-life. I just wish it was somebody other than Donald Trump, quite frankly. Yeah. But the bottom line is that you do have a rather sad dynamic of people who need affirmation and need acceptance, receiving it from someone in a grand way, and therefore commitment coming with that. And it might be commitment apart from ethics, and I think in some cases it has been, and that's part of the tragedy of the 2016 election.
You've raised the concern here and as well in the book that there's a threat to the faith that can come from this, and people who care about that, some of us do, we're thinking a lot about that, the role of Christianity and its influence in the world and people's understanding of it and all that. That's very important. Do you personally, at this point, have any? What's your level of fear for the common good, for the country, for the civic order, for the international order? Where do you put yourself on the spectrum of freaking out about how bad this could all go? And how well have you slept the last 366 nights?
I sleep very well, by the way.
Okay, I haven't slept
in the arms of Jesus, as the old saying.
There you go.
So I have my confidence in God, not in DC, and I'm sitting in DC right now where I live. So I will tell you that I think that there's a tremendous potential for loss of something valuable, and people may be surprised by my first point in my answer, and that is that I think that the better side of the religious right, the better side of prominent religious leaders in our country, has done the country a lot of good. I think when prominent religious leaders have talked about racial reconciliation, when they've talked about the poor, when they've reminded us in books and in speaking about our founding fathers and a heritage of faith and things of that nature. I mean, Billy Graham will pass from this life pretty soon. Please God, there are some great documentaries that remind us of how he took a stand for racial reconciliation, how he went into the South and sat with black pastors. And so I'm saying the better side of these prominent religious voices, conservative for the most part, yes, but still there. I think if those are disregarded in our society, if those are ignored, if they are perceived to have been compromised in this recent election so they're no longer heard, we're going to be poor as a nation for it. I see. Then, not only because I tend to hang out with a lot of African Americans, I'm not boasting, but my wife and I attend a church here in D.C. that's about 4,000 African Americans. I help out a little bit with that church. They call me the white spot. And, I think that the potential, the stat that we all cite is that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, but evangelicals of color are watching from the fringes going, oh, so it didn't matter to you that he didn't like us or that he was racist or whatever the conclusion is.
Yeah, that has real potential to be damaging, doesn't it? Do you know what those percentages are? I've heard so often the 81% of white evangelicals. Do you know the number of non-white evangelicals?
And then I think we also have it was below 40. You're talking about you're somewhere in the 20 to 30% range for most of them at best.
Yeah.
And that's a real tragedy. Yeah. I mean, so the bottom line is that, and then I want to mention one other category, if I may, very quickly, and that is the millennials. Even millennials who may consider themselves evangelicals. I've kind of picked on Dr. Falwell at Liberty University, but a large chunk of his students there at that university, when he was giving such a full-throated support to Donald Trump, wrote a declaration and said, "Well, we're not comfortable with this. This isn't where we are." So the potential for the evangelical church to lose the young, not over Jesus, not over ethics, not over biblical truth, but over politics, is great. And I, like you, I know of churches splitting over this issue. I know of families that don't get together for Thanksgiving anymore. I know of young evangelicals who have left their churches. I'm not saying it's rampant, but I'm saying it's there, and it could increase as a trend if the Trump administration continues to have some of the missteps that it's had.
Well, Stephen, thank you for the book. It's called Choosing Donald Trump. Great work, and thanks for being part of this today.
Great to be with you, man.
Are you going to be anywhere else soon that people can find you if they look you up, or if they want to be tied up in your world a little deeper?
The best place to check me out is stephenmansfield.tv, and we'll communicate anything about what I'm doing on Twitter, which is @MansfieldWrites, @MansfieldWrites, and then my website, stephenmansfield.tv.
Thanks for bringing that up. I'm guessing it's Writes, WRITES,
Writes,
as in you're a writer.
WRITES, yeah. I'll do a website one day called Mansfield Writes, RIGHTS, but my rights aren't that infringed at the moment, so I'm not too worried about it.
Hey, well, thanks. Really great to meet you, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks so much, man. God bless.